about this hand thing? Bunch of hooey?
There has been a lot of positive evidence published. And informally, that is not through publication, there's some non-trivial amount of negative evidence that hasn't been published. So because the nature of the incentive system and the way that journals work is such that it often doesn't come to light when there are failures to replicate. I would say caution would be in order. I wouldn't say that it's a bunch of hooey, but I would say that caution would be in order. The logic behind the argument is a reasonably sound one.
Which is how the finger length comes to be.
That's right. There's also the fact that a large number of the publications have been produced by a small number of authors, right? Which one would have more confidence if it was distributed over a larger number of investigators, just because that would show that there weren't experimental effects or something else that was going on that was inadvertent in producing these positive results.
Yeah.
So, I mean, as you pointed out, it's relatively easy to do. One can do it, I think, double blind. So you can scan the baby scans and have the measurements being taken by technicians who have nothing to do with evaluating the rest of the data,
Yep.
and who never saw the baby, so they don't have any perceptions of maleness, femaleness, who don't know anything about the other attributes of the study and the other attributes of the infant, and see what you get. There are other anthropometric measures that you can take. Certainly, I wouldn't tout this because the number of studies proportionate to those that have done the 2D, 4D work is infinitesimally small, but we've got some initial evidence that there's a pretty clear sexual dimorphism in the ratio of the size of the foot to the stature of the individual. And that's a relatively easy thing to measure also.
These are grown-ups?
These are all in adults. Yeah. And that actually raises a second issue, which is that it's quite possible that that neither of these things are going to be predictive, nor is any other anthropometric measurement in infancy, because you're prepubescent and therefore the relevant activating effects of the hormones haven't taken place. I'm a little, since I have the floor, I'll continue to pontificate. I'm a little concerned about the salivary testosterone measures, again, because it's likely to be extremely noisy data. Testosterone fluctuates pretty wildly, even on a circadian cycle.
Yeah.
And it's not clear that one's current level of testosterone should predict cognitive function even in an adult, right? That whatever infrastructure has been built as a consequence of the hormone milieu is built and is not influenced on a moment-by-moment basis. We might expect reactions and behaviors and things like that, aggressivity, for example, or something like that, to vary on a more transient time scale. But underlying cognitive functions, I'm not sure that there's a lot of mileage there.
Yeah, well, if there's
I
any...
didn't review your grant.
Okay, fine. So if there are any reviewers of the grant in the room, then just go away, please, and I'll know you aren't. But I'm assuming that there aren't, and we frankly just kind of were surprised and nobody called us on it, because we have no idea what we're doing. We've never done this before. But, so what? We always do things that we have no idea what we're doing. That's how, when we first set up the eye tracker, I had no idea what I was doing. Just, so what? You just do it. So, they're going to give us some money, we're going to do it, and it might work out, it might not. I don't know. Why not? Just try it. Do you have a question?
Maybe for some of these weird results about different kinds of objects, there could be other kinds of domains.
Which results are weird?
Oh, well, like a hand versus a that where you don't have to know what the explanation is. I mean, it seems to me that in addition to, there could be other kinds of domain-specific types of domain-specificity kinds of possibilities. In adults, you get there appears to be at least some degree of specialization for object recognition, as you probably know, for artifacts versus living kinds. You get neural associations in adults, and even within the domain of living kinds, there could be special stuff that has to do with hands, faces, various kinds of body parts and what they do. I think that there are some results with mechanical claws versus hands and imitation, right? And also often more
Yeah.
where
Yeah.
babies will imitate a hand doing an action, but a mechanical claw doing
Right.
the same thing.
And they'll interpret actions by hands and claws differently.
So I mean, maybe there's something like that where even very early on, I mean, I don't know how you test it, but maybe very early on they're treating these as special kinds of objects for those reasons. And the other thing is for the ERP thing, you might consider taking out, or not taking out, but analyzing separately, or at least looking for separate effects for the social stimuli that are in fact artifacts, like Elmo, right? I mean, it's not clear that kids.
You
I mean,
know-
there's evidence like Susie Johnson stuff that if you make it beep and interact with the kid, even a furry ball can be treated as a living thing, but you don't know for sure if they actually think that Elmo is really a.
Actually, in my latest pass through the stimuli, which was a couple of days ago, I decided just to get rid of Elmo and the teddy bear.
Oh.
Yeah, for exactly that reason.
Okay.
So we're gonna try to use just really readily recognizable body parts, at least what we assume the babies will be able to recognize, faces and hands and feet and maybe things like ears and noses. We had a picture of legs, and I thought, you know, baby's gonna recognize legs, and I don't know. So we're trying to cull more photos from Google image search or whatever that are more sort of clearly like, boom, you can tell what this is right away.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, so following up, I think on Clark's, I would say also it might be interesting to, a lot of the sort of mechanical objects in this, at least in this current lineup, are designed by humans. They have design features. Might be interesting to also consider including a few objects that are, you know, just objects that, you know, nature produces that are not designed by human forces.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's just a lot of agony about, you know, what is the best. And so if we have a particular hypothesis about males preferring mechanical stimuli, then we have to use artifacts.
Right.
And really, I want to keep the kinds of objects we use pretty, the range to be pretty tight, because we start including everything, you know, the data are going to be so messy as it
Right.
is. This is going to be a horrendously nightmarish study to do. Anyway, but you know, so what? Let me.
On the chasing dots video you showed, in addition to looking at the one that was chasing the man, it seemed like they were looking more at the chaser than the chasee. I was wondering if you're looking at that at all for.
Yeah, we've talked about that. We'll be in a better position to
Yeah.
answer that than me.
Well, so from eyeballing, I haven't noticed that pattern so much, but it is true that certain kids seem to have a preference for either agent. I'm currently looking into ways of actually trying to analyze that. It's hard for a variety of reasons, but it's an interesting suggestion, and I'm still in the process of thinking about how to code it, basically.
Okay.
I have kind of a broader question about the distinction between social stimuli and mechanical stimuli. Because, I mean, in thinking about sort of an evolutionarily driven hypothesis, I mean, both males and females need social stimuli, need to be able to read social stimuli, and they also both use tools and need to know how to use mechanical stimuli. I mean, so I'm just wondering if by breaking it up in that, it seems like a sort of artificial distinction to me. And instead of trying to think about what types of social stimuli females might have a preference for versus males, and then within mechanical also. So I'm wondering how much of a sort of male bias there might be in what types of, mental rotation, sure, might be one way, but are there other kinds of these kinds of mechanical stimuli that maybe females are better at than males?
That's a great question. I don't have a great answer. I really don't know. I mean, we're still very much struggling with. I mean, I'm being really sort of open about all the different questions that are swirling around. You know, we have a very small set of data. It's positive data, and I believe the data, but we're very, very short on explanations. And so, we're just trying all kinds of things, and I don't have anything resembling a good answer to that question.
I think Elizabeth Cashton has done some work, and I actually haven't read any of it, but I know I've heard her talk about doing some work where she was trying to look at some of these differences and relate them to hypotheses that were driven out sort of hunter versus gatherer kinds of.
Yeah,
But
I don't know. But these are 5-month-old babies, and they're not hunting or gathering, they're just sitting there looking at things.
Yeah, but you're obviously trying to cue into things that are going to be useful pieces of knowledge. I mean, she's not looking at actual hunting versus gathering either.
Would I really have predicted this? I wouldn't have predicted this, for exactly the reasons that you said. Why would females have a preference for social stimuli? Boys need to know who mom is, and conspecifics just as much. Little boy ducklings have to follow the mama duck just as the little females do. I don't know. And yet, back a couple of months ago, we were thinking about why the boys were showing evidence of MR and girls weren't when they were infants. We thought, well, it could be as simple as the fact that there could be, I didn't make this up. Other folks have made this up, as you well know. So we thought, let's just try a social stimulus. Well, that doesn't really seem to be working out. We're just not getting, really interpretable data. So, do I believe this? I don't know. But we can test it. We can maybe do a ham-fisted job of testing it, but we can test it. So that's kind of where we are. Yeah.
It's kind of related. It seems like a lot of times the social stimuli that are used are dolls or teddy bears or things that are neotenous, and so I think this is related to what you're saying, that it might be the type of social stimuli that females are queued up to be interested in. So the monkey study, if they had full size, if they had, monkey-shaped dolls that didn't have neotenous features and they were full size, would that be the same? Would the males be as interested in that then? Because then it's socially relevant stimulus.
I think that study is problematic because it makes just sort of silly assumptions about what's masculine and feminine. Trucks move when you touch them. What a weird thing is that? So you have a novel object and you touch it and it moves. That's pretty scary because, that puts it into a class of things in the world, which is different than the class of things in the world where you touch it and nothing happens, right? So I think that their choice of stimuli was, unlike that lovely work, what's his name, from that woman at Stanford that came down, where she, really tried to figure out what is it that the babies react to as animate or non-animate. They didn't do that. So they had these inanimate dolls, and they had these very, kind of weird, these things that move. So they didn't work very hard to figure out what it was that little boys and girls were choosing. Males and females, those were babies.
I don't know if we get at this, but you could take, the boys are better at these mental rotation kinds of things. So what if you confounded that with a social stimuli where, for example, you had a person in one orientation and then a person in a different orientation. And sometimes it's the same person and sometimes it's a different person. So the boys might be picking up on this person is standing, even though they're different people, whereas the girls might be picking up on the fact that this is a different human being.
There are studies looking at infants' recognition of people from sort of, frontal views and then three-quarter views or one-quarter views or whatever. And so I've emailed the authors of those papers, and they say, there aren't any sex differences there. So that's not exactly what you were asking about, but it's not that dissimilar. So yeah, I don't know. Hang on one second. There's also a new study that showed these are 6-month-old babies, an array of stimuli, like 8 stimuli, equidistant from a fixation point. You track the baby's attention to the fixation point, and you show the 8 stimuli, and one of them is a face. And so the baby is just, very simple. The baby's eye movements are recorded, reaction time to find the face. Are there sex differences there? You expect girls would be faster? No, they're not.
I want to back up to something you said a moment ago in response to Brooke's comments about Liz Cashton's work. You said, well, none of these babies are hunting and gathering, and they all have to interact with parents. That's absolutely true, but I think it potentially misunderstands the ultimate functions of some of these developmental differences. So by the same token, you might say, let me give you two lines of argument to support that. One, by the same token, you might say, well, prenatally, male fetuses and female fetuses have the same problems to solve. They have to get enough nutrients, they have to build tissue, that's pretty much it, right? That's all they're doing, right? So there should be no sex differences prenatally, right, in anything. And yet, perhaps there are. Well, why might there be? Because those are preparation for a function that only gets operationalized later in life. So granted, both male and female 3 or 6 month old infants, their principal job in life is to eat, sleep, grow, and interact with those who are sources of nourishment and some information around them, right? But they are preparing for roles later in life that may potentially be sexually dimorphic. Right? Similarly, so for example, one sees, and other people who know the primate literature better than I do can correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to me that there's a pretty reliable difference in rough and tumble play between male and female primate infants and, or juveniles in general, not infants, juveniles. Their jobs in life, as it were, are the same, not get eaten, grow, and so on, right? But they're preparing for social roles that will be substantially different, where fighting is going to matter a lot more for males than it is for females later on. So one could imagine that there are differences in skills and preferences at this age that have no functional significance at this age, but that are a part of a developmental trajectory, including a preference for interacting with kinds of objects that will result in subsequent environmental experience that will facilitate learning for skills that are important later in life. So in that regard, that ties into the suggestion earlier that, well, perhaps you should have non-artifactual objects in here. Well, one might ask, what is the ultimate function of any male advantage in this mental rotation? And it seems to me, and I don't know, people can tell me if they know the ethnography better than I do, but if it is the case that in societies, in lithic societies, that males are primarily responsible for tool production, right? Because making stone tools involves an awful lot of mental rotation and complex imagining of the possibilities, that there could be, substantial utility in males having this. There could be selecting pressure principle for males having an advantage in this. If that's the case, then showing baby stones, for example, doesn't solve the problem, because even though it's not an artifact, right, you still want to know what the affordances of this object are for producing artifacts, so you might still get the same difference. And it seems to me that thinking about what the ultimate function of a potential difference, but that potential difference may not be real, might guide the research a little bit more than, well, let's try it and see what happens.
Well, that's always been my strategy, though. But thanks.
Don't mess with success.
Yeah.
Building on that a little bit, I seem to recall that in adults there is a sex difference where there's a female advantage in color discrimination, which fits in a little bit more with this hunter-gatherer kind of stuff. And so maybe instead of looking for effects in broader versions of these categories, you want to look for sex differences at a more fine-grained detail in terms of different aspects of visual stimuli, the same stimuli, but which, in some cases, they vary by mental location, sometimes they vary by color, and looking at that kind of low level.
Maybe that should be experiment too. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that one. Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that.
I'm thinking about I'm thinking about a number of different things which come up here, but the differences that occur male, female, I don't know how early they occur, but the fact is by 4 or 5 months, and probably before that the male, to pick up a male at that time, he's much more likely to squirm out of their hands and get back to his toy on the floor or whatever else. Lots of activity. Whereas a female, I think, you can find with observation, that they're much more likely to be very happy to crawl up in their mother's or father's arms and cuddle. and I didn't hear you mention anything like that. And it seems to me a very important sex difference, because the boys are then getting mixed up with things, playing with toys, opening drawers, holy terror around most homes, as many mothers will tell you. Just got to be pulling things, doing things, and so they're spending an awful lot of time in exploration and manipulation.
Okay, so I've looked at that question, and this will take about 2 minutes to give you the explanation, or how we've looked at that question. So in a study I didn't tell you about, we were very interested in the relation between, so if you recall, success at this task seems to develop, if you want to call it that, success, seems to develop between 4 and 6 months, and this is the same time that infants are really starting to interact with objects on their own. It's also the same time that infants are starting to sit on their own. So we looked at the relation between self-sitting, that is learning how to sit by yourself and not falling over, which developmental consequence of which could be freeing up the hands for object manipulation, a developmental consequence of which could be learning that objects have backs that you can't see. So there's a developmental cascade here which is triggered by sitting up, right? So we've done that study, and it showed us, it revealed that the babies who were sitting up by themselves did in fact engage in more visual manual exploration of objects in a separate task than this one. I'm not explaining this very well. We replicated this effect and added on the same day tasks that assessed self-sitting and visual manual exploration. And there's individual differences everywhere you look in all these measures, but it turns out what lines up is the kids who are self-sitting are the ones who are manipulating objects and looking at them at the same time. Those are the kids who showed a preference for the hollow object. So the question is, great, are the boys the ones who are doing this more? And the answer is no. There were not sex differences in any of the measures we took. Self-sitting, visual exploration, or manual exploration. There were also not sex differences in this particular sample in the replication in looking longer at the hollow versus the complete. So we were very interested in exactly, well, sort of very strongly related hypothesis to what you're mentioning, and we just didn't find evidence of sex differences. Yeah?
What's the age range in your categories of, are some of them, 1 day into their 4th month, or some of them after 30 days of their 4th month?
So what's the boundary of age?
Yeah.
It's generally 2 weeks plus or minus. So a group of 5-month-olds will actually range from about 4.5 months to about 5.5 months.
So, thinking a little bit more about sort of the ultimate reasons why you have sex differences, it is kind of odd when you think ecologically about what men and women have to do in traditional societies. I mean, Brooke is right that there's nothing that you can identify that, well, maybe not nothing, but there are a few things where it wouldn't benefit both sexes to have this skill. And I mean, something to consider is, which I think Baron Cohen actually suggested in his stuff on sex differences, is that there might be trade-offs at some level of the system, such that being good at one thing necessarily makes you a little bit less good at the other thing, so that you can't simultaneously, and I mean, I think the hormone thing might be a good way to go with that. I mean, that might provide some evidence that if the brain structures involved in these things are linked to hormones in some way, then you may see that there may have to be some sort of developmental commitment to specializing in one type of skill versus the other to a certain degree, such that, and I don't know if we know anything about the brain mechanisms involved,
Yeah.
but that being able to attend to and deal with social stimuli necessarily in some way, and I mean, I don't think this is a prediction in any way that you would get from evolutionary theory, but it could be a consequence of the way brains are built, that there's some kind of trade-off at being good at one thing entails you not being quite as good at the other thing.
Looking
And I
at
think-
something means not looking at something else.
Yeah, and I mean, my recollection, I had a hard time reading the Baron Cohen book on this, the essential difference, where he talks about, but my recollection is that he presented some data that suggested that there might be a trade-off, that people who are on the far end of the extreme at being, say, really, really good at dealing with mechanical reasoning or whatever, are also the people that tend to be really bad at the social stuff, and vice versa, which would suggest somewhere in the system there's a constraint such that it's difficult to build a brain that's equally good at both things.
Well, but are the extremes representative of, you know, the rest of us?
Well, but so the argument he's making there is that you just see distributions, like you map these skills and you'll see a normal distribution, and what you see in men and women is slightly skewed but very highly overlapping.
But that's my point. You're talking about the people who are at the tail ends. Do they really tell us what's going on in the middle for the majority of people?
Oh, I don't know.
For whom the distributions are overlapping.
I don't know, but I mean, but showing that somebody's in an extreme end, positive on one skill, entails having a greater likelihood of being at the extreme end negative on the other skill. To some degree, implies overall that there's a trade-off. I agree it might not tell you about the normal case, but yeah, I mean, and another thing is that it doesn't necessarily tell you where in the system the trade-off is. So a lot of these experience accounts that you're talking about could be very consistent with this idea. The trade-offs could come from how you allocate time attending to various different things that then influences the developmental process, so that by the time you just spend less time honing a particular skill than another skill, and there's going to be a time trade-off there. It might not be hormonal mediated.
Yeah, that's a reasonable developmental mechanism.
Yeah.
And I guess we're working on it. Yeah.
Wouldn't you pick up that trade-off on that subsequent study you showed us where you have those stimuli arrayed on the, if you got a negative correlation there between, so the people that attend, the kids that attend most of one.
Well, the question isn't
would be there.
attention. We're expecting, these are very brief presentations. The question isn't how much they attend. The question is what's happening in the brain as they're attending.
Right, but whatever you're using to measure, that's showing some kind of activity directed towards social or non-social. So the ones who are showing most activity, the one should show the least of the other, and vice
Sure.
versa.
Yeah. Yeah.
With the normal kids rather than the extremes.
Yeah.
Have people done menstrual cycle studies and menstrual rotation in adult women? Because this would tell you whether you get transient effects of hormones.
I'm reaching way back in here.
I think Dorian Kamura's done that, isn't she?
What's the last name?
Kamura, K-I-M-U-R-A. It's old research though, so it may not be, the methods may not be what we'd be satisfied with today.
I don't know. I want to say yes, but that's just a guess based on, it's way back here, I don't know.
The point being, before you embark on swapping babies, it's worth, I mean, if you don't see it in adults, then you wouldn't expect to see it in between you, right?
So, I see, so we should be testing women at various stages in the cycle and seeing,
There's a pretty substantial fluctuations in things like testosterone across the cycle, right? And if you don't see any performance differences as a function of cycle phase, then that suggests, it's about organizing the brain.
Unless you also get an impact on adults that women, I look at one of those mental rotation tests and I think, oh, that's impossible. And I mean, it would be, that's my primary response, because I know I can't do that, right? And so, you have to sort of learning of your own.
and also,
Incentivize it, right?
also the comment that I think you made earlier, which is, when you're talking about a system of brain that's already gone through the entire lot of developmental process anyway, versus a child for whom all these developmental phenomena are happening at once, there could be completely different kinds of effects of testosterone on how the system is organized. So even if you do or don't find cycle-specific kinds of outcomes in women, adult women, that could have nothing to do with infants. It could have a lot to do with infants. It could be used to narrow the predictions or not. I mean, I just don't know. But it's worth, it's worth thinking about.
Are there animal models that are analogs to these? because certainly there are lots of experiments manipulating hormone levels, both in adults and during development in animals.
I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. Yeah. I don't know. I think all the literature I know is humans.
Okay, well, if there are no other questions, we're just about.
Thank you, Bill.